Hi, I'm Barry Moore, and I'm going to spend a few minutes today talking to you about the origins of the Internet. We take the Internet for granted. It's on our refrigerators, it's on our cell phones, it's on our computers. It just seems like it's always been there. But the truth of the matter is the Internet as we know it is really only about 13 years old. What I'd like to do today is go behind the scenes of the Internet and show you what historically led to the creation of the Internet and give you some ideas for the future of the Internet. The real roots of the Internet really, like so much else technology, depends on electricity. And electricity is the foundation of the Internet as it is of most media. Even something like the telegraph needed electricity. So the Internet really needed electricity and it needed computers. And what we want to do is look at this evolution of the computers as it led to the Internet. First thing we should look at is post-World War II America. It was a paranoid time. There was fear of the Russians. There was fear of nuclear war. There was fear that America was not safe. During World War II, some labs at MIT began experimenting with huge mainframe networks in order to have defense communications solidified. These defense networks, after World War II, formed into what was called Distant Early Warning System. And the Distant Early Warning System was a computer linked by telephone network system to protect the United States against nuclear attack from Russia. Most of the impetus that created the Internet was initially created by the Department of Defense and Americans wishing to protect itself. So what essentially began as a military maneuver became by the 1990s in the hands of civilians. The network known as SAGE was one of the first manifestations, civilian-wise, of this distant early warning system. In the 1960s, there were telephone connections for all major airlines. They were connected by the network, and that network was a kind of precursor of the Internet. The launch of Sputnik by the Russians, a satellite that hovered above the United States and the world in 1957, really triggered the beginnings of the modern Internet. The United States Defense Agency was concerned, paranoid, and decided they needed a network to protect itself against nuclear war. They formed an agency for advanced technology and research. That agency was called ARPA, and that stands for Advanced Research Projects Agency. It would later be renamed DARPA. It was the aim of this agency to develop technologies, advanced and otherwise, to fight new methods of warfare symbolized by the Russians. Because of the challenge of nuclear war, the challenge for ARPA was to find a way to network that could not be destroyed, where there was no central node, no central mainframe computer, that there could be perfect switching between all computers so that the network could survive in the event of a nuclear catastrophe. The network would switch information off like handing off hot potatoes. That lack of centralization, that ability to hand packets of information off, is the core, or one of the cores, of the modern Internet. By 1969, the United States was looking at getting away from mainframes, computers, big, monstrous computers that could fill a room the size of this studio, and look at smaller computer terminals that would begin to transfer and transmit this information. What we really mean by the Internet is the routing of information that was developed between the late 60s and the early 70s. In the late 60s, they were able to route information without any one computer mainlining that information or controlling it. Internet routing meant that no one at every computer node could possibly afford a computer mainframe. And so people looked at the option of having computer terminals linked, and those terminals would send packets of information using a language, or as they called it, a protocol, that would enable these computers to communicate. This method of communication, of inter-networking communication, shortened, was the internet. This was where the word derived from. The method of networking computers by a common protocol, and they could communicate. Because they could not buy mainframes for all the various nodes, largely at this time it was scientific labs, universities, and the military. The remedy was that ARPA would commission the creation of a new technology to enable distance access to computers instead of having mainframes everywhere. It is this decentralization that indeed was the internet. The early efforts at internet communication were stymied by a number of factors. You could not simply send a stream, let us say Shakespeare's book, by the internet and it would come out as text. It was discovered quite quickly that the internet would be overwhelmed. They were using telephone wires then. They were not using optical cable, optical fiber, big broad pipelines. They were using telephone lines and discovered that they could not transmit a lot of information. Part of the solution of the internet protocols was to break communication into small packets. I like the word packet. It indicates to me if I have Shakespeare's book, I would take Shakespeare's novel or plays and put them in envelopes, perhaps 50 envelopes. Those envelopes are packets. Those packets simplify communication and allow me to use the internet. When they get from one end of the computer to the other, the packets reassemble, and that packet holistically is Shakespeare's novel. The development of those packets is called the TCP, or Internet Protocol, and that is what, in the early 70s, allowed all computers to share a common language. It is that development of the common protocol, or Internet Protocol language, that allowed the linkage and communication. Prior to that time, a lot of computers, take for example a network in Hawaii called Aloha Net of all things, were all using their own protocols. By simplifying and moving to packet switching and the TCP IP network, the internet plan allowed all computers to communicate with each other. The development of the internet protocol, the 500,000 users and over 100 nodes, allowed for many radical developments in the late 1970s. Perhaps the most important was created by a man named Bob Metcalfe. He invented Ethernet, the method by which local area networks could communicate with each other. At the time that Metcalfe invented Ethernet, please remember there weren't even any personal computers at this time. He had, in essence, invented something that was waiting for the personal computer to happen. But local area networks were a reality by 1973, but only the advanced scientific and educational institutions were using them. Metcalfe came up with a rule after he created the network, which really presages what occurred from 1994 until the present of 2007 with the internet. It's come to be known as Metcalfe's Law, and it is probably one of those silly things that seems obvious, but it is so important to the development of the internet and what we accept as the internet today. This is Metcalfe's Law. The power of the network is n squared, where n is the number of nodes. So if you double the number of nodes, you actually double, squared, or quadruple the overall value of the network. Put in human language, what Metcalfe is saying is, the more people that use the network, the more valuable that network is. And I believe as we see the globalization, internationalization of the internet today, it is really a function of the mass growth that Metcalfe predicted when he created the Ethernet. Another consequence in the 70s of the internet, just for scientists, was email. Roy Tomlinson, a scientist, devised an experimental program using FTP to go to individual network mailboxes on users on the node. He created and able to create and send message software for the mailbox. This became email, or electronic email. It was Tomlinson that invented the @ sign, which is the universal symbol now for communication on email and the internet. By the end of the 1970s, most of the major assets that would become part of the internet, email, TCP, IP, and networking, were in place. What remained to occur, and really occurred in the 1980s, was the rise of the personal computer. During the 50s and 60s, it was companies such as IBM that had huge mainframes. If you wanted to have access to a computer, you needed to have access to a company that was able to afford the computer and the network. Steve Wozniak of Apple had to sneak in on the evenings to a large mainframe in order to learn programming and how the mainframes worked. By the 80s, many homebrew networks were making their own computers. In the midway point of that decade, the Apple II, the Apple Macintosh, the IBM PC all began to emerge, where a full-fledged computer was sitting on an individual's desktop. I can't emphasize how important, how decentralized, how radical this notion of democratization of the computer occurring was. It is this democratization, along with increasing sophistication of the computers, of the networks, that gave us the internet and the World Wide Web that we understand today. The three events that transformed the internet were the creation of the World Wide Web, which, contrary to what you may think, the web is a piece of the internet but is not the entire internet. 2, the lack of commercial restrictions on the World Wide Web. And 3, the internet browser or the web browser. Those three factors would coalesce in the 1990s and begin to generate the revolution of the past 17 years that we call the web. The first invention is what is called hypertext, something you take for granted today, where if I see a word like Shakespeare and it has blue line under it or it has an italics and I put my mouse over it and I click it, it will suddenly take me to every link possible that is connected with Shakespeare. That linking is referred to as hypertext. It had been the dream of computer users since the 1940s, that by seeing one link, you would be able to go to another link, that would go to another link, that would go to another link. And that is hypertext. The creation of hypertext generated the World Wide Web. The man who invented it worked in Switzerland. His name was Tim Berners-Lee. He created the World Wide Web by working out a program called Inquire Within. Inquire Within was not a graphical user interface, but it did allow the user to use hypertext to go all over the nodes and computer monitors or computer workstations, those connected to the internet. The Inquire software allowed scientists to share the web with hypertext documents. That is the key development. It's possible to say the web was developed by Berners-Lee with hypertext. But Lee's invention, like those computers from 10 years earlier, was all text-based. Lee's program was not using graphics. However, what Lee gave us was the URL, the HTTP address, and the HTML hypertext markup language. Those languages of hypertext are what have generated the World Web. Final component of this was a college student invented a browser taking what Berners-Lee had done and made the browser look graphic, accessible, not designed for a computer scientist, but for an average person. The first manifestation of that browser was called Mosaic. Mosaic is a kind of interesting story because Mosaic became commercialized. Mosaic became the first internet browser called Netscape. And at the time that this occurred, no one thought the internet had commercial potential. They were just trying to get a simple way to interface with it that the average person could use. Obviously, the graphic browser Mosaic was it. The Mosaic browser meant that you did not have to be a computer nerd to browse the internet. The average citizen could browse it as if it were a comic book. However, Mosaic was esoteric, not widely shared. It was known through various user groups. A man named Jim Clark, who would later go on to create many internet entrepreneurial things, including Silicon Graphics, Jim Clark took Mosaic, improved upon it, and created the first true internet browser, web browser, called Netscape. He released Netscape and then created a company around it. In 1994, it was assumed that the internet had, even with these sexy new browsers, Mosaic and Netscape, no commercial potential. Jim Clark did an initial public offering of the company Netscape, began to work with other companies to network into Netscape so that Netscape's homepage had advertising on it. His initial public offering of Netscape set off the internet bonanza of stocks in the late 90s that would result in the bubble in 2001. But Clark, with Netscape, proved that the internet could make money and be accessible by the average citizen. Most of this background is what has given us the modern web. Now that we've looked at the creation of the networks, the creation of the internet out of war, if you will, the democratization of the workstation by the personal computer, we really should look at what we have today, which is known as the web or the World Wide Web, or if you want to be incorrect, the internet. What does it mean? It is so pervasive. It is so much a part of our life. It is very difficult to get in an airplane or a helicopter and go up 40,000 feet and look down and say, aha, that's the internet. It is so much a part of our consciousness, especially in the Western civilization, and certainly it's going to internationalize soon, that we don't think about it. But what is it? What is this World Wide Web? And I frankly don't know. I can show you these maps of the World Wide Web, and I can tell you it's a separate universe. It's a universe charged by electricity with millions of users, millions of nodes, no central place except for the routers for which it comes from. It is pervasive, unknown, and in many ways untouchable. It is everything and yet nothing. It is, if we look at these internet usage maps, a universe unto itself. A universe that doesn't look that unfamiliar from a galaxy. Another way of looking at it is that this universe that is the web is a higher form of consciousness. Some people like to refer to this as cloudware, as if we have our own minds, collectively or individually, and floating above our heads is cloudware, is this separate neural connection, this separate universe. It almost looks like a neuron that is the internet. Many years ago, a religious philosopher, Teilhard de Chardin, referred to a connection of a higher mind as a noosphere. Many have used this metaphor to describe the internet, as if we are all connected now, no matter if there are oceans or mountains or clouds that block us. We are all connected in a noosphere, a universe, a global village that is the internet. It is that world that is the future. lest you think that you're on the cutting edge of all of this, I want to go back in time now to wrap this up. In 1968, a researcher named Douglas Engelbart did a computer demonstration that was called and still is referred to as the mother of all demonstrations. In 1968, Engelbart demonstrated the personal computer at this demonstration. He demonstrated the computer mouse using crude technology at the time, using landlines, using some internet protocols, using audio and visual. He was able to connect his show in Menlo Park, California with another computer in San Francisco. He gave us audio. He gave us video. He gave us networking. He gave us the mouse. This was all in 1968. I wonder just what is new about this thing we call the internet. The Electronic Media and Film Department has always had as part of its mission and goals to be student-centered. And part of being student-centered is having a strong advising program. Our faculty is committed to one-on-one advising with students. And we really want to urge you to meet with your advisors. The university now, obviously, because of holds and flags, asks you to come and see your advisor, otherwise you can't register. This is a kind of carrot stick punishment philosophy, which really is not what advising is all about. Most students do use advising just in pre-registration, but really advising is a chance to build a relationship over the time you spend in college at Towson with an individual who you can trust for curriculum advice, personal advice, or even career advice. I just would like you to get beyond the notion that advising is about removing the flag on your PeopleSoft record for registration and begin to meet the faculty who are waiting there, who are working with you, and learn that advising is just also talking and getting to understand your faculty member as well as the faculty member understanding you. Make the best use of it, and I think your time at Towson will be more rewarding.